Hello, everybody. This is Trip, and you're either listening or watching Homebrewed Christianity. And today on the podcast, I have my friend Adam Clark here so we can lure you
Hey,
or
everybody.
call you if you are uncomfortable with Whiteheadian phrases to join our upcoming reading group on Black theology. So, Adam, thank you for hanging out and, you know,
Great.
and reading with us and guiding us through some amazing texts.
Great. Yeah. Look, this is the right person to think about at the right time. We're in a very um, interesting historical moment now, and I think Cone will be a good person to guide us through and think about different ways of how to be faithful in this historical moment.
Mm-hmm. So if people are interested in signing up, they can go to jamesconewasright.com. I don't know why that URL was still available. It seemed clear to me already. But jamesconewasright.com. And over the course of the class, we'll be reading a large amount of James Cone, but also other figures in Black theology to introduce not only its history, its tradition, but the way in which those resources can be utilized in our present moment. And I don't have another friend I'd rather do that with than you, so I'm pretty pumped about that. So for people that haven't met you before on the podcast, what are your favorite things to say about yourself? Like when you're trying to give people the
Oh,
Adam
wow.
Clark vibe.
Favorite things. Wow. Trip, you always ask the most interesting questions and that I'm not prepared for. I generally say, look, I'm a professor of theology at Xavier University. Um, my specialty is Black theology or African American theology and religion. And I was trained by James Cone and got my doctorate under him at Union Theological Seminary.
Mm-hmm. And like, are you in town? Like, are you into those like weird hot dogs they have
No, it's chili
or
in
chili?
Vermont.
Weird.
Yeah, it's weird chili. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, sweet.
Well, you know what? I don't even do beef, Trip.
Oh,
So I'm a pescatarian.
a
So
pescatarian.
yes, so I do fish and seafood and don't do beef. So I don't really indulge. So I'm not the best person to ask about that kind of.
So when I was in town, and I don't remember the name of the church now, the Episcopal church we both spoke at, and
Right.
they had a
Yeah.
chili cook-off. You know,
Uh,
uh, I really feel like it was important for me to taste them all, and
Veggie chili, I do. I do veggie
yeah,
chili.
the in different parts of the country has been my experience. Some have only meat in it, some have only beans, and then some have both.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but
Yeah.
the key is not putting as much chili seasoning in as you think. If you only put a little bit with a large amount of tomatoes, it makes it pop. That's that I've been
And
present for a
spice
lot.
too. You gotta spice it well too, man. That's what
Oh
really
yeah.
makes
The
it.
so so over the course of the class is kind of centered on a number of different key questions that you drew out and
Mhm.
all that kind of stuff. But we're going to be reading James Cone. But since you were a student, and
Right.
what's a James Cone story to give people the vibe if you get to hang out with him, and one that is live streaming on the internet appropriate. I know that like if you ask me that about Philip Clayton or Monica Coleman, I'm going to give it. I'll give a story, but it depends on the audience as to which one you're going to pick, especially when they're high quality, entertaining figures. So,
Right. 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 Well, my first time meeting Dr. Cone, um, I applied to be his doctoral student. He wanted to meet me. So I remember coming into his apartment and he had a beautiful apartment and everything was just so immaculate and so well put together. And I remember talking to him, he left the room for a minute and I looked up and I saw one of his books, God of the Oppressed, in like 27 languages. I mean, it was in English, Korean, Portuguese, Spanish, German. And I remember saying, this is the most serious man I've ever met in my life, like thinking to myself that audibly. And I remember just being awed by just the number of books. And I don't think there's 27 books, but there's like about a good 8 to 10 languages that was translated. And you know, I had been around professors who published books, but the impact,
Mm-hmm.
especially in theology, was pretty awesome. And I was like, yeah, if I could just be with this guy, I'll be okay. Right. So that was one thing. Another I guess a funnier thing happened is when I was TAing for James Cone. I remember people asking him, because the way he teaches is not, people expect his classes to be more evangelical like he's trying to proselytize Black theology. And really, in his classes, he wanted you to be a critical thinker. He didn't care if you agreed or disagreed with his personal views about theology. He just wanted you to explain them with rigor and push you. So he never pushed a viewpoint on people. He just presented a theological tradition and wanted you to engage it. So I remember people like who weren't very familiar with him reading some of his earlier works, like in the 1960s when he's coming out the movement. His language is really reflective of movement culture, versus his later works where they're more academic, because that's where he's socially located. And I remember a student coming up to him and said, "Dr. Cone, do you still believe this?" And I think it was something about, if you see the white Jesus, kill him, you know, one of those type of sentences, right?
It's kind of like if you see the Buddha on the way.
Exactly. So I remember Jim Cody looked at the text. He said, "I believe it more now than ever before." He went out and did this whole thing, and we just fell out laughing because even though the language and the inflection might have changes, he still had that fire in the belly, and that's one thing I always remember about it.
So I mean, when you say that, I think of um, the current controversy on whether or not it's a good idea for a large number of churches to have Swedish Jesus up on the wall. Now, it's honestly not a very good painting, right? Like that very famous white Jesus painting, it's kind of looks like a dude on the cover of a romance novel that without as many muscles as some of them have. But um but I think like how do you think we should frame that conversation? Because one of the elements of Black theology is the recognition that contextual theology in the context of a white supremacist America requires a specificity that makes a lot of white Christians uncomfortable. And when it goes to like calling out the fact that you have Swedish Jesus on your church wall,
Yeah.
just seeing the backlash about that on Twitter makes me think, yeah, it'll sound kind of crazy. James Cone was right.
Right. Well, you know, well, I think this is a historical moment. I was with a group of clergy and pastors about a week ago, and most of them were celebrating all the type of overthrowing of Confederate statues and neo-colonial statues. But my challenge to them was, well, that's easy for you guys to do, to look at Confederate statues and neo-colonial statues. What about that white Jesus who's more dangerous, right, than the Confederacy and the neo-colonial figures there? Why don't those get overthrown? You have actually control of that. So I think this movement, that this historical moment that we're in right now, offers a challenge, right? Not just to those type of people, but all of us should make a deep reassessment of our heritages. And that white Jesus has been much more deadly and killed much more people, right, than these type of monuments to the Confederacy.
And here's one of the things that stuck out to me. And no, I haven't always thought this. So like, I'm not saying it in like this should be immediately obvious sense, but you know, Christianity it has a very, very long and complicated history. And there are moments where the church, you're like, hell yeah, you're the church of the living body of Christ. Well done. And then there are other times where you're just like, I think I'm just going to skip a couple hundred years, and wait for something else to come. Like it's a complicated history where you're complicit in ugliness and also the birthplace of beauty. And right now, America is having that same moment where
Yeah.
all of a sudden, enough of the people on the underside of our story were given microphones and they were plugged in. So enough of the privileged people heard it and said, that just don't sound right. Right. And all of a sudden, right, like the complicit history of ugliness and the complicated natures, but yes, also these different dreams and longings that if they were true would be beautiful, and you don't know what to do and make of it. How how do we speak into that experience for people that are wanting to complicate the way they relate to their history? What is it like to finally having the dominant culture say, yeah, our history is more complicated than we thought?
Yeah.
How do we begin to process it? Because I think the church has a complicated history we don't always let on, and so does the United States. And
Yeah.
it's there's a type of hermeneutics that if you're a person of privilege, you aren't comfortable with in
Yeah. It's a total,
dissecting a tradition.
but see, this is what Metz calls this dangerous memories, right? Wrestling with dangerous
Yeah.
memories, where you're looking at the victims of history. And I think what America is doing right now is looking at the victims of history, right? Just like Christians, Jesus was a victim of history, right? So to me, there's a structural, this is what Black theology draws out. There are structural parallels between the Black condition and the conditions of Jews in first century Palestine,
Yeah.
right? So therefore, what's happening in a public way is that there's a reassessment of American history in light of the victim's eyes, just like there's a reassessment of Christianity from the eyes of below, from the view from below, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think these are two parallel movements that need to happen, where we just can't look at secular society and say, oh, look at what's going on, and become basically observers or late adapters, right? Christianity should be in the leadership of that type of change and transformation, because what's happening, we're struggling for a new creation, right? And Blackness is the entry point, but it's not, it doesn't end with Blackness. It's an entry point into looking at a new and full creation. And I think that's where theology and faith communities can be very helpful by not just looking at the politics of it, but looking at it as a vision of faith that could push it forward. So when it's not out the headline, there's still a push toward looking at, to striving for a new creation.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's important. And when the way you put it as like a starting place for thinking about a new creation, I I've been thinking through teaching a couple classes in the next semester, and inheriting classes that were previously taught by people in the UK, right?
Mhm.
And it's philosophical theology classes means you have you come at certain questions differently. And so I've been thinking of how to introduce it. And in the weeks dealing with kind of philosophy of revelation, I've thought about how in the 18th and 19th century, theologians wrestled with how you start to wrestle with um, natural revelation stuff like science, things like that, right? And then and then the academy became too capitulated to the ideologies that were like they were unaware of, that were present in the academy, in the elites, in the dominant streams of Western thought, such that then in the 20th century you get people like Karl Barth, Bultmann, and such that are addressing through kind of the theologies of the word, theologies of crisis, the way in which the liberal traditions capitulated to Nazis and such. And Bonhoeffer does stuff like that, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
and
yeah.
Cohn kind of extends that Barthian critique and goes like, it's not just that the word comes from the outside and critiques our ideology. You have to ask where it shows up. And where it shows up depends on your context. And if you're going to use the word God and it's associated with Jesus in the United States. God is black and so is Jesus, so you're just going to have to handle it, right? Like, and that is simultaneously one of the most offensive statements for some people and the very manger in which a life-giving vision of new creation that could be birth comes out of, right? Like, and 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 I just think it's so surprising that he does it based on the very material reality of the first century Jew, Jesus. And he goes like,
Right, yeah.
basic cultural analysis means Black Lives Matter, and God's black. And but it's not to be offensive. It's to say that if the theology that comes out of this is going to be real good news, it has to at least be as good as the God that showed up in a first century homeless Jew in Palestine who got all that prophetic funk from his mama and spoke game so straight until the empire tried to take him out with some perverted versions of religion. And God says, check this out. 3 days later, boom, shakalaka, resurrection. Right? Like, and so there's a sense that the situation of revelation is part of our cultural analysis.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
now at this point, there are more people ready to listen to theology from the very place God decides to show up.
Yeah, I mean, and this is a point of contestation throughout the theological tradition, as you well know. The German culture was a culture of superiority, was a very hierarchical culture. So, of course, the prophetic move at that moment was to disassociate revelation from any type of cultural striving.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're talking about cultures who've been subordinated, there's a need to try to find revelatory meaning within the cultures and history of people who've been suppressed. So when you look at the liberationist tradition in general, Black theology specifically, but liberationists in general, you see people trying to talk about their pre-Christian cultures, right, as having revelatory meaning and talking about how God is was infused within that culture. It wasn't just some type of pagan or heathen type of culture that had no type of sacred meaning itself, but there's a need to really try to discern and extract sacred meaning from that culture and really have a sense of multiple belongings where we belong to our African heritage and our Christian heritage both equally, and we're nourished by both of them. So that's why you see such stress within the Black theological tradition on pre-Christian heritages and on their Christian heritage that's distinctive from other groups who actually emerged in the United States.
Mm-hmm. So, a couple of things that came up for me, just even in announcing, like, we're going to do
Right.
a class in
Either
Black theology.
discussion board you're talking about?
Oh
Or
yeah,
just
I have now gone from banning 3 people since 2008 on homebrewed Christianity to 170.
really? Not
Yes.
just the Black theology discussion board. Are you talking about just that one or?
No, I'm just saying, like, on the post that I shared about this class, a couple crazy ass white people shared it on some racist board, and then they start commenting, and I just like abandoning them.
Oh, is that? I was wondering where is all this coming from? I couldn't even keep up with it. I didn't know
Yeah,
where that was coming from.
no, and I just think, man, lockdown means some people are bored. And
Wow.
then they decide to use their boredom to make
Okay.
themselves look
Yeah, I
like
thought
they're
that
in
was your
need.
people trip. I didn't know that was like some other board. I thought that was your people because it was over
No,
500 comments. It seemed like it was like
it,
3, 4, something like
I
that.
know. I was sitting there and I started digging on the internet because I thought, where the hell these people come from? Like, like if you're going to say the things you're saying, like, why didn't you complain earlier?
Uh-huh.
And but in it there were like a couple like general responses I just found maddening. And
Mm-hmm.
and I wonder what like the one of them that came up consistently, and I have been trying to think of a nice way of responding because I don't want to be inherently mean,
Right.
but
Yeah.
uh and I feel like someone posted this email and they all sent it to me because there's variations. Like, I got 7 emails basically looks the same. They said
Really.
that that said I had turned over the keys of religion,
Mm.
which one, I'm not sure why religion has keys to begin with, right? Because they're usually connected to locks. And religion should probably be something that leads you into more life. But besides the point, I had handed over the keys of religion to slave logic. And then I'm like, are you talking about Nietzsche? Nope, this email is not that complicated. This is not someone that read Nietzsche, and um
Oh
and
my
they said,
God.
and and they said like Christianity was a gift that we gave to so many people, and now we're just
Wow.
going to let them steal it from us. And like, it's
Wow.
whatever the hell's going on in that. I just don't get it, right? Like it,
Wow.
and yet, like, they can't be that many far steps away from me. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like,
that's
and
serious. I didn't see that.
and no, I deleted and banned hundreds of people, Adam. There's some
That's
crazy things.
wow.
And
Really? Okay, because I did not see that.
no, I have spent quite a bit of time going through regularly, and I added a whole lot of words that I have to approve comments to get shown. Like, once
Yeah.
this Reddit feed of these
Oh,
like white nationalists decided to come comment on the post,
wow.
I anyway, but like, when they said that, I just wanted to go like, this is what the response I wrote to one of them, which I shouldn't have, because then he threatened to kill me, and I was like, I'm in Scotland, you can't even fly here right now.
Oh my
But
goodness.
I just said, here's the deal. I don't even know how to tell you this, but literally, white Christianity owned people.
Mm,
Like,
yeah.
and we still go to churches with large amounts of white people, sing the same hymns slave owners sing, and
Right.
are uncomfortable changing our doctrines all the time. Slaveholder religion has justified top-down coercive power for a long time, and
Wow.
I think we should just say what is normative Christianity in America is the black church, and
Wow.
not in like some like, oh, we're going like in a naive type of way, but just to say that if you wanted to know what God's favorite expression of prophetic Christianity looked like, it didn't happen in Jerusalem, it happened in Galilee, right?
Wow. Yeah.
And 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 I don't know what I mean, I don't know like the best way of putting it, but I just feel like there is uh a decision to make
Hmm.
as to where you allow God to show up. And if your privilege means you're always pulling back the
Hmm.
ability to listen and hear from others,
No.
then I I just feel like the biggest heresy of Christianity in the United States is white supremacy. So
Yeah.
if you can't even say that, why are we going to let you decide what's orthodox?
Well, I'm glad you told me this because I wasn't aware. But our first class, and maybe people like that need to take the class because it would be an introductory discussion because
Oh yeah.
it really is. And this was a challenge in terms of the Black church, and Malcolm raised this challenge to the Black church: is Christianity a white man's religion? Now, he made the same analysis, but had a different intent in that. He was trying to break Black people away from Christianity because he believed it was a slaveholder's religion and that the Bible made Black people docile, right? And not really trying to fight for their liberation. And he believed that Islam was much more militant, much more radical, and that it was easier for Black people to fight their enslavers if they had a different religious perspective than it was to have the similar ones. And the whole emergence of Black theology is really trying to wrestle with the legacies of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. Malcolm gave the Blackness in Black theology, and Martin gave the Christianness of Black theology. So the Blackness was really trying to look at Black history. Before Malcolm X, Black people referred to themselves as Negroes. Even Martin Luther King, if you read his speeches, he'll talk about Negro boys and girls. He doesn't talk about Black, using the term Black. And this is not just a semantic, this is a conceptualization of Black life. That Negro was seen as a deferential human being, deferential to whiteness, while Blackness was seen as much more self-determined. So Black history and Black culture dates back pre-Christian, right? Like, and I'm talking about all the way back to ancient Egypt, right? There's a tracing of that, even pre-Judaic roots of what Blackness is. Um, the Christian dimension happened from King, and King changed the Christian paradigm at a time when Billy Graham was at his height, right? Because Christianity was seen as just saving souls or giving your hand to the Lord. And what King did, King had the idea of salvation wasn't about just giving your soul to the Lord, it was about the achievement of beloved community, right? So the idea of atonement was God heals brokenness to achieve beloved community, not to evacuate you to heaven. And that idea of having this type of social justice orientation to Christianity and the Blackness fused together to form what we refer to as Black theology today. And our first class is going to really deal with the understanding that, contrary to what most people think, the Christian church was in Africa before it reached Europe. Matter of fact, there was no
Yeah.
Europe at the time of that. The first church, the Coptic church in Alexandria, is supposed to be from the writer of the Gospel of Mark, at least allegedly, right? So you have the Coptic church, and then you have you have the African, even people you think were Greek, probably thinkers, were really Africans, such as Augustine, Athanasius, Origen. These are all North African thinkers. So part of what Black theology does, this is not necessarily Cone, but other dimensions of Black theology, goes back and traces the African origins and really tries to decenter Europe in the kind of spreading of the gospel, because you had much more developed ideas in Alexandria, Egypt. You had the greatest kind of Christian library. In Carthage in Africa, you had the greatest Christian libraries. And before you have the rise of the modern kind of Roman papacy that starts the Latin church, you have all this rich African things in the early formation of Christianity. So you really wouldn't have a Christian tradition if you didn't have African participation early on. And that's not something, and because of the imagery has been so Aryanized, right, that you don't get a sense of the African dimensions of these figures who you might admire, but not locate them geographically in Africa. Right.
One of the elements about that's been striking is just the way that a lot, even the figures you named, like Origen, Augustine, and such, the erasure of a non-Eurocentric expression of like the dominant Western Christianity shows up in art. It shows up in the way they are the history of their interpretation, right? So like when, I can't remember. Oh, I'm trying to remember which friend said this, but one of my friends was writing a dissertation on Augustine and like North African interpretations of the Trinity, right? And he just said, the problem with writing this dissertation is a couple hundred years after Augustine, the only people that talked about him were people who had no idea what his life experience was like. And then if you want to write about him, you have to write using footnotes of people who forgot he was ever from Africa, and so like that forgetfulness element in a history or a tradition is powerful, right? Like, or if you think about like the erasure within a tradition.
Right. And I think it's intentional too. And I think a lot of it, because you see the people closer to his day actually did tell the truth, but you'll see this also with, you'll see when slavery started, right? Martin Burnell in Black Athena makes this point too. He talks about when you have the type of emergence of chattelized slavery, you had much more intentional and deliberate type of, he calls it the Aryanization of Western history, where even Hellenistic philosophers who really talked about Ethiopia and Egypt in very glowing terms. Those were like not emphasized in text. Othello, everything gets kind of whitewashed in this type of history, but a lot of it actually was to justify the kind of material practice of slavery. So you could justify these people came from nothing. So therefore you don't have to feel bad about treating them as property, right? And this all this type of intellectual, ideological edifice to justify the thingification of Black people was part of this type of project. So there was an intentionality above that, even with the disciplines of science with phraseology and all of these other types of pseudoscientists to really try to justify it. So when you have this type of intellectual practice or kind of economic practice, and then you have this type of scientific justification, and then kind of give it religious meaning, it put the West on this course, right, to do the most catastrophic things to non-European peoples.
Yeah, it's in one of the, I think one of the difficulties of this moment, and this is really based on like getting emails from people at very different places and kind of awakening to the history that they're a part of. Like just today I got in these three emails kind of like, I think show it, like a friend of mine, he's an African American minister and in a more conservative theological tradition, but he's just like, I don't even know at this point. It's just so frustrating. Like, it's just hard to stay Christian even though I'm down with Jesus,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
because like people think we're having this giant breakthrough, and the giant breakthrough is basically whatever the NFL and NASCAR thinks counts as a breakthrough. And
Right,
like
right.
that's like that's like basically the slaveholders' inheritance. And why
Uh-huh.
are we going to trust them to be the deciders of what counts as quote woke, right? And then I get another email from a friend that is a white minister who is long time invested in, you know, the racial reconciliation industry, who then feels bad that he has like been working so long for racial reconciliation when it seems like that's a demand for the black church to be docile and just decide to cooperate for the world in the world as it is, and we can be friends. When he's like, I realized, like, I felt like my presence there was not encouraging real genuine uh anything genuine to reconciliation, because I'm asking them to take what they've already been given. And I didn't ever frame it that way, but now that I'm starting to see it in light of this larger picture and stuff, I feel uncomfortable about it and that kind of thing. And then I get this email from a friend that I would have just told you was racist if
Mm,
you'd asked, and it
mm,
wasn't on the internet. And
mm,
he's
mm,
like, Trip, have you ever thought about the fact you know, and insert things that just seem like really obvious to you? He
mm,
goes, and they're wrong. Is wrong. And I don't know what to do with that,
right.
because it's so different than the stories my grandpa told me.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
and in one sense, right? Like, if we could abstract ourselves from the situation, we want to affirm the beauty in each place, right? And encourage them, the best thing to come out of it. But then like the way you respond to one person and one thing could like affect the way other people hear you and others. And I don't I don't have like a question for it, but I just feel like
Right. Yeah.
if 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 you're more open to things you weren't open before, that's a positive thing.
Mhm.
And the proper position for someone in privilege is listening. And then if you're uncomfortable when you're listening, that probably means you're doing it well. Right? Like, and I feel like that's why I was so
Yeah.
excited to do this class, is that we're going to read James Cone at his fiery points before any of this stuff happened. And Homeboy didn't hold back. You know what I mean? Like, I just like, I've been rereading a lot of this stuff, getting prepared for this. I'm so excited because this, like, there's a historical distance that also enables you to get the unfiltered
Yeah.
experience. And then
Right.
we can process it in a group where people are going to be coming at it from different places.
Right. Well, you said a lot there. First, Cohn was very concerned about the nature of Christian identity, or
Mm-hmm.
what the public meaning of Christian identity actually was. And most thinker of his time period, and even before, Christian thinkers really, because they had to justify, why are you Christian?
Mm-hmm.
These people are the architects of slavery. They're the architects of segregation. And they still, how can you act that to him, race was a challenge to Christian credibility, right? That how can
Yeah.
you be credible about the love and justice ethic of Christianity if it's paralyzed by the color bar, right? So most African American thinkers, especially in the early 20th and late 19th century, really had that as their top priority, and they would make a distinction. Howard Thurman has a famous story where he goes to India, and a Hindu lawyer comes up to him. He says, "Why are you here?" And the guy says, "Well, I'm with the delegate, the reconciliation, the friendship of reconciliation." He says, "No, no, no, I'm not asking this. I read all that, but why are you here?" And then he goes on to explain. He says, and he gives this whole historical narrative about 400 years ago or 200 years ago, your ancestors came to the United States on slave ship. You've been beaten, burned, bruised, so much so that even um, I've heard at some churches in the United States that they would stop service and go and lynch somebody and then come back for morning worship. And then the guy says, "You sound like an intelligent man. You look like a decent person, but I consider you a traitor to all the darker races in the world." Right? And Thurman's sitting there kind of stunned, right? And that made him write his first book called Jesus and the Disinherited.
Mm.
And what he said was, he says, there's a distinction between the religion of Jesus and the religion about Jesus.
Yeah.
And he talks about the religion about Jesus is slaveholding religion. The religion of Jesus is how Jesus experienced God and expressed it. So he would talk about the religion of Jesus and try to embrace that. Cohen makes a similar type of thing between white religion and Christianity. But what they all are saying is basically white people have been the most unfaithful witnesses of Jesus Christ in our culture. And you can't use that as a model or a paradigm for Christian religion, because too many of these churches have the standpoint of elitism. With liberation theology makes the whole thing about social location, that you have to have, or as Pope Francis talks about, that a shepherd has to have the smell of sheep, right? You have to be in the trenches with people in order to understand their perspective. So viewpoint means a lot when you're trying
Yeah.
to reconstruct the tradition. And so when we read Cohen, we're going to look at how he makes a distinction, how he justifies, because that becomes a critical in his early work about what does it mean when someone says they're Christian, what are they actually saying? And how does that comport with who Jesus is and what Jesus did?
Mm-hmm. When in one of the questions that has come up from a couple of people ask exactly why does Cone make the connection between the cross and the lynching tree, right? Like, and part of it is that, for the historical purposes, but, underneath it is why at the end of his career versus earlier are you going to make that connection? And I think, projecting onto the individual that sent me the message, weren't things worse earlier in his career versus now, right? And I think that element, right, like how you see the progress or not progress or stagnation or step backs over time, how would you kind of describe that and what's going on symbolically
Yeah.
in the connection between the cross and the lynching tree in the present?
Right. Well, he uses lynching. Lynching is certainly is a literal event, but it's also a metaphor for Black suffering. So in a way, he's always been talking about lynching. He just didn't use that term or that metaphor of lynching. But what he's doing there is looking at, Gutierrez put it this way: You can't talk about the death of Jesus without talking about the real deaths of people today,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's not just some metaphysical death. That's the way to actually understand the meaning of a person whose body was rejected, who was criminalized, who died through state sanctioned violence, right? You have to be connected to the very people today whose bodies are rejected, who get assassinated from state sanctioned violence. That's George Floyd,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's a whole lot of Black folks who have been died in police custody. So what he's saying is that um, a way of trying to unlock the meaning of the crucifixion, which he describes as a first century lynching,
Mm-hmm.
right, is to identify experientially, right, with contemporary lynchings. And then you could see the window instead of the cross being this ornament, right, or this type of symbol of adornment
Yeah.
that has no connection. And to him, that's what Bonhoeffer referred to as cheap grace, right?
Yep.
And the cross is just more of a decorative symbol, right, than really talking about the meaning of God's activity in our contemporary world. Right. So for him, it really saves it's actually redeems the cross. He says they both interpret each other. It's not just the lynching tree goes to the cross. The cross interprets the lynching tree by saying death is not the last word.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That so and the lynching tree interprets the cross by giving it substantive reality. So it's not some type of symbol that floats above human experience, but grounds one deeply in the human experience that God identifies with.
Yeah. And I think that's part of, and John Tatominal just mentioned this on Facebook. One of the reasons that substitutionary atonement is so problematic.
Yes, he's absolutely right. Yeah, he doesn't. I mean, that's critiqued by womanist theologians, right? Feminist theologians, and Cohn acknowledges that critique. He's really talking about how how the the cross really speaks to a certain brokenness that tries to achieve a just community and not just some type of interiority, like it's personal interiority that the tradition, popular Christianity often asserts.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that struck me recently when I was listening to the audiobook version of Said I Wasn't Going to Tell Nobody, which is the James Cone autobiography, is not only in it do you get kind of like the story of Black theology and his own experience in it, and then the way he was impacted and changed his mind by encountering his students, be it the womanist theology movement from his students, LGBTQ students, this type of thing. But when it gets to the cross, it was one of those segments where he's like, but still, I don't want to get rid of it. Right. Like he wants to recognize the way in which the cross was used to then tell someone, here's a sacred narrative and cling to this, because then you get to remain a victim. He's like, I want to take that ticket right out of their hands and throw it away. Yeah. He said, but the other side of the cross is that the cross reveals to everyone who is suffering, you have solidarity, and that solidarity goes right into the very heart of God. And for those giving the violence, it says you don't just have the victim to give an account for, you have to give an account to God. And so that, like, and I've been working on this. It's done now, but I just recently finished editing the chapter, a chapter on the cross in my next book. And the image I've been trying to get in doing that was that the cross is a transferable nightmare, that it gives you the right nightmares. And if you get rid of the cross for people of privilege, then you don't get the nightmare that wakes you up to the death you're dealing.
Right.
And the cross is the very place. And Douglas Otati turned me on to using the Scrooge example, right? But like he gets visited by the death, like the ghost of Christmas past. Like here's the death you've dealt. The
Mhm.
ghost of Christmas present. Here's the death you're dealing in the one in the future. And he falls in his grave, and then you get the choice: do you rise to new life, right? But none of that
Mhm.
means that God was the agent of the killing. But it does mean
Right.
that the cross is a symbol of the transformation, because it's precisely by getting right with reality, which is one of Cohn's phrases, like
Mhm.
getting right with reality, the truth of the consequences of your action in the institutions and systems you're part with, that new life's possible.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely. Yeah.
and I think that that's an important thing to hear for white liberal Christianity, because a lot of them stopped even doing prayers of confession because they're uncomfortable with the word sin. Like not just the
Right. Yeah.
cross,
Yeah. Yeah.
they get turned into like positive psych hour.
Right.
And in and he in the book, in that chapter, he was insisting, go like, no, if you get rid of the cross, if you get rid of sin and these things, you miss the human predicament, and we aren't
Yes.
less screwed up
Absolutely.
than you imagined.
Well, it's a wrestling with the reality of evil at a very deep way. I mean, I remember being at Union at a time when Dolores Williams' work was um, on the ascendancy, and people were really coming at Cone hard about, why are you with this cross thing? And the cross was seen as passe. And he was simply explained, he said, the reason why I affirm the cross is because poor people, not just in the United States, but around the world, that's their symbol. I'm just actually being in solidarity with what they say is meaningful for them about the faith. And for him, it was a recognition of the depth of evil and really God's solidarity with the poor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And really, if you're coming to wholeness, that there's going to be involved suffering and pain, right? Like he uses Niebuhr's, I think, language of terrible beauty,
Yeah.
right? And that there's a certain paradox of faith that the cross represents as a symbol that no other symbol within Christianity is as effective at really talking about. So that if people who already are in a Good Friday world and Good Friday moment, an everlasting, seemingly duration of Good Fridays, to them, the idea of the cross is that there's hope. That is not the last word, it's not the definitive word, right? And I think that's why the cross is so powerful in terms of its impact with people who are on the bottom.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we want everyone to go to jamescohnwasright.com and sign up and join the class, because it's pay what you can. So that means you can pay $0 or $1,000,000.
We like the
Just-
million.
yeah, or anything in between. Um, but I mean, you can sign up for
But get your
free.
money worth a million,
Yeah, yeah. If you're friends with the current occupant of the White House and he feels like paying some penance and joining and getting edified, you can advise him. Like anybody is welcome to join. You can join under a pseudonym. We're gonna have fun. So the like I had 3 questions I want to ask, because we don't have to say too many things since we're going to spend 2 months talking about this.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
but but you get to, but see, it's a game called hot takes, so you get to say something, you don't hold yourself accountable for indefinitely.
Oh,
Goal is
God.
just to say something that's tweetable.
Trip, you're getting me nervous now. What we doing
Oh
here?
yeah, exactly. Now it's kind of like a rapid fire round,
Oh, gosh.
um, but of questions that people that the homebrew members are like, are y'all going to talk about this? So
Okay.
this is not like we have to give your final answer. It's more of like a whet your appetite. You know
Okay.
what I mean?
Okay.
But you're just like, do you want to? You gonna talk about this? I'm like, yeah.
Okay.
First question. Are you gonna talk about the relationship of race and class? Because and then there's a long thing, but basically about like the Cornell Rest, Adolph Reed, and this type of whether or not racial analysis or class analysis is a better analysis for our current predicament.
Yeah, that's a really important question. And I would point people to Stuart Hall, who talks about how class is lived through race,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like how we can talk about them as separate analytical categories, but really they're lived very intersectionally. And when we talk about, we even have these type of kind of popular cultural terms such as ghetto or white trash to really as class indicators there. So those type of usually demeaning type of categories are really trying to indicate certain types of class distinctions, but
Mm-hmm.
it's really, they really live through each other.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. And no, oh, I'm never mind. My game, I'm not allowed to say anything else because
Okay.
these are just ideological temptations for people to go to jamescohnwasright.com and sign
Was I
up and
supposed to
tell
be
their
more
friends.
spicy in that, or am I supposed to answer these seriously, or am I supposed to?
No, here's like how you could answer. You could do this. You could be like, Cornel West is completely wrong, and if he wants to prove me right about the preferential role of class and racial analysis, he has to come into our group. You could say it like that.
Ah,
Or
there you
yeah,
go.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
okay.
You see,
All right. I need
you
some
see,
coaching on this one. I'm gonna do
yeah,
better
yeah.
next time. Okay.
Or you could say Adolf Reed's best move was his son, who's even more sophisticated and nuanced than himself, but nonetheless very high quality analysis. Something like
Okay.
the
All
all right.
right.
The next question, the next question was, um, if you could pick any monument from church history, and I think this is a metaphor, to remove, like if you think of like those people you were forced to stick on your syllabus. Obviously not a Jesuit. We're not going to pick a Jesuit. They're all like, because I know how much you love every Jesuit, but if you were going to pick any of the required readings of like every Christian ministers in training, you're just going to like take the monument of Saint so and so and then and drop Papa Cone right there in that space, so that next thing you know they're stuck there in that, like, we're talking about the early church Christological controversies, and they're like, well, we got the
Wow.
Athanasius saying this, we got these different controversies, and all of a sudden they're like, Jesus was black, and you got to interrupt the logic. Like, what monument do you want to have a little exchange program on?
Wow. I wouldn't even think of an early church. I would think of a 20th century person. I would
Okay, we can do that too.
I like I would think of maybe a Southern evangelist from North Carolina, maybe, you know.
Ooh, Billy Graham. Okay,
Maybe that would be it.
he didn't mean Billy Graham, but
Maybe that is. Maybe that would
but
be a
you have
good
to
like
admit, that how many like dominantly white evangelism classes would have a game change if
right. That's what I'm
if
saying. That would be
like
more impactful.
you all of a sudden they're sitting there like, how are we gonna bring people to the Lord, and
TBN would look very different.
TBN would look very different.
It look very different with James Cone as the kind of model, right?
When Pat Robertson got uncomfortable with Donald Trump and told him that's just not cool because his racism was so on Front Street.
That was crazy, right?
Yeah, like I've never wanted to retweet Pat Robertson in my life, but you just see like, and you've seen over time, if you was just watch enough YouTube clips, large of the muscles in his face haven't been used in a long time. Either it's getting like, he's getting LA'd with the wrinkles or whatnot. But all of a sudden, when Donald Trump goes up in front of of an Episcopal church after gassing people to wave a Bible,
Right. And
when
hold the Bible
very
upside down like a dirty
yeah
diaper, and
yeah when he does that, Pat Robertson's like, that's just not cool. Like, and you're like, I haven't seen you get that animated in forever.
right, yeah, yeah.
He hadn't been that animated since a black guy was president, and you um okay, so the last let's see, let's pick which one of these is most fun. All right, so I know this is really complicated. Like, on Fox News, it's very they're trying to decide which is worse: uh, the state destruction of its own citizens' lives or protest destruction of insured property? Which do you think is more problematic?
Hmm. The state destruction. The state
The state,
destruction.
the state, I don't know, let's say they, I don't know, choke someone to death
Hmm.
or have a prison industrial complex. Like there's a number of ways the state just like eliminates life.
Hmm.
And then you also have on the occasion protesters destroying insured private property. And
Oh, okay,
and
okay. So
I just don't know which is worse because I'm a both sideser. You know what I mean? Like I see like a dramatic form of institutional structural evil, and then I say, but what's something else I can say is about the same on the other side? And then I saw some white dude with a skateboard throw a rock through a Starbucks, and I said, it's kind of the same thing, Adam. You know?
well, if this is the homebrewed audience I was talking to, I would say, you know, what would JC do, right? And we have a couple of JCs. We have the original OG JC,
OGJC.
right? You have John Cobb, and now we have another JC, James Cone. And I think
Oh
they
hell
all,
yeah, that's what I'm talking. We got Jesus Christ,
that's right.
John Cobb. We got Jack Caputo, just Catherine Keller
I
because she.
forgot that. I forgot about Caputo. Okay,
Now we got James Cone.
there we go.
We're gonna have to change our names, Adam, if we want to become super legit theologians. Like we're gonna have to come. We're gonna change our names to something with the initial JC.
But the thing is, they will all answer that question similarly, right? So that should tell the audience something.
Yeah.
Right?
And in case people weren't in the Whitehead group, uh, John Cobb's response to this question was, so are people unclear of the passive, ongoing historical and institutional violence of white supremacy towards the poor and the planet? Like, it was just like, what did this Starbucks window get broken in a vacuum? It is a and if if the joking signaled that we are in a very different place than you, but you're still semi-interested, you should join the class, and I will lean into my pastoral sensitivities.
There we go.
But I'm super excited about getting to read these texts with you and getting to introduce people that have always like wanted to read them to getting to read it, people that are searching and seeking, and I've gotten some people like, I read these when I was in divinity school. I haven't read them in forever.
Yeah.
And
now is really the moment to really reflect with Cone about where we are as a country, right? We're in the world globally, because this movement is going around globally, and we have just a reassessment, right, from a new standpoint of racial scripts of domination, historic scripts, and contemporary scripts. And I think Cone will help us understand this from a faith-based perspective on where the church should go, because the church has been the tail light, not the headlight, this movement, right? And I think one of the reasons why has it been a leader, it's been a late adapter, not an early adopter. Mm-hmm. And part of what I think this class could do, if you actually go into this class, is that it can help you be ahead of the curve and not behind the ball, right? Mm-hmm. So hopefully that type of training, that type of thinking about what it means to be prophetic in this moment, right, will help you form your ministry and your discipleship in new ways.
Yeah. So you can go to jamesconewasright.com and sign up. And for those that I saw people have been asking, tomorrow, assuming I've finished the last 2 pages of the article I'm writing, you'll get an email that has a link to most of the reading, but there are 2 books we want everyone to get. So do you want to say something about them?
Oh, yes. I tried to select things that are accessible because I know that people are extremely busy. But James Cone's For My People, right, gives kind of a broad overall sense of the early movement of Black theology. It was written in the 80s, so it's really up to them, but it gives you a sense of the birth of the movement, and that's where I want to really get people. And then Sisters in the Wilderness, Dolores Williams, one of my dear professors, first full-length text on womanist theology. And I think that's an important move that happens as a critique of Black theology, but also is included within the expanding vision of developing vision of Black theology. Well, a womanist component within that.
Yeah, and the goal for each of the you'll get a link. You go to the resource page, and there's like different articles and selections for the 4 big deep dive sessions, which are ones where Adam will be giving a lecture, then he and I will talk through a bunch of the reading, and I'll ask questions and stuff. And between each of those weeks, there are also a special session. We'll have special guests join to talk about different elements connected to Black theology in America and such. And the goal was for the every other session, the deep dives, for you to have more time to do to the reading, and then to send in your questions and stuff like that. So the between sessions are not reading demanding, but will hopefully expand the number of voices in contemporary Black theology you've encountered, and also give you 2 weeks to do the reading instead of 1, because not everyone professionally reads theology.
Is that so?
It is. I keep telling people, like when you tell your friend to read a book, and then 3 or 4 months later, they're like, "Hey, I really like that book you mentioned," and you're like, "I told you that." I guess. So
Cone's first book is his first 2 or 3 books were not written for the academy at all. They were written for the movement. So Black theology, Black power, Black theology and liberation, and spiritual in the blues. Like, he wasn't really thinking about academics. So people who like movement texts that are written with the kind of verbiage that was trying to appeal to activists and not intellectuals or academics will really like that book. The first academic book he writes is like God of the Oppressed, where he's at Union at the time and really trying to write for his colleagues, trying to explain this Black thing to his colleagues, right? But I prefer the first couple books, right, before he gets to that. It's got a certain type of punch to it that I think comports well with where we are in this moment.
Well, I'm pretty pumped. I'm very excited you agreed to do this, and it's almost 1 a.m. here in Scotland. So,
oh my goodness, okay,
yeah, I got 20 minutes before 1 a.m. So,
okay,
just so you all know, Adam and I were talking like an hour before we even went live, because we got excited. And y'all haven't even heard what's going to come up when we talk about panpsychism and Black theology. We had an excursus on, because Adam's been talking to a couple of his whitehead friends. He's been reading Process Hardcore, and then we started talking about Black theology encountering panpsychism, and then I was talking about this research I've been doing on the bifurcation of nature, and junk just exploded, and then that delayed our start time, which has meant that my bedtime's been delayed, and now I'm too excited. I got to go cool down, It's always good to have super nerdy friends. And
I don't claim nerd for myself. I'm a cool dude, but
you're too cool. I lean into my nerdiness so much so I may even I'll just switch my.
He had a DC. He had a.
I got my Thor background now. That'd be better. Got my Batman.
Like Batman onesie on. I tell him, look, Trip, you gotta take that off.
I know I took my onesie off, but I still got the background. All right, but everyone, remember, only show your utility belt to people you love, and have a good night.
Take care. Look forward to seeing y'all. Take care.
All right, JamesCohenWasRight.com.